My brother stood up at our Thanksgiving dinner table, clinked his crystal wine glass, and announced with a smug smile that our parents had secretly given him the company I built from the ground up. He looked me dead in the eye and said I was officially relieved of my duties and that I would be leaving with absolutely nothing. So I took a slow sip of my Cabernet, looked right at my father, and asked if I should tell them now or if he wanted to do the honors. My name is Audrey, and I am 34 years old. I never thought my own flesh and blood would try to steal my life work right over the cranberry sauce. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I destroyed their little corporate coup without even raising my voice. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey and sage stuffing, but the atmosphere was suffocating. We were gathered at my parents' house in a wealthy suburb for what was supposed to be a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. The antique chandelier cast a warm glow over the fine china, projecting a perfect picture of a happy family. But beneath the surface, it was a shark tank. I had spent the last decade pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into EcoShift Logistics, a supply chain management firm I founded from nothing. I sacrificed my 20s, skipped vacations, and worked 90-hour weeks to turn it into a highly profitable enterprise. My younger brother Brandon, who is 31, sat across from me. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive suit he definitely could not afford on his own. Brandon was the classic golden child. While I was building a real business, he was bouncing from one failed startup to another, always running back to mom and dad to bail him out of his terrible financial decisions. Sitting next to him was his wife Naomi, a sharp and fiercely ambitious African-American real estate broker who always looked at me like I was an obstacle rather than a sister-in-law. We had just finished the main course when Brandon picked up his silver fork and tapped it against his wine glass. The sharp clinking sound cut through the low murmur of conversation. He stood up, puffing out his chest, completely commanding the room. My mother Susan beamed at him with absolute adoration. My father Richard leaned back in his leather. As you all know, EcoShift has grown. EcoShift has grown significantly over the last few years. But to take it to the next level, it requires real leadership, a strong, capable presence to steer the ship toward the future. Mom, Dad, and I had a long talk about family legacy. They realized that for the wealth of this family to truly be protected and grow, the business needs to be in the hands of the son. I set my fork down slowly on my plate. "What exactly are you saying, Brandon?" I asked, keeping my voice completely level. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal envelope, tossing it onto the center of the table right next to the gravy boat. "What I am saying, Audrey, is that Mom and Dad have officially transferred their 51% controlling interest in EcoShift Logistics over to me," he gloated. "As of yesterday morning, I am the majority shareholder, and my first official act as the new Chief Executive Officer is to inform you that you are relieved of your duties. You can clear out your desk on Monday morning. I will have security escort you out if you try to take any proprietary files." The room went completely silent. Naomi smiled, looking at the legal documents on the table like she had just won the lottery. My mother reached over and patted Brandon on the arm, looking at me with cold, calculating eyes. "We just think it is time for you to step down, Audrey," my mother said sweetly. "You are 34 and still single. Running a company is too stressful for a woman your age. Brandon is married and he needs to provide for his family. You should be happy for your brother." I looked at the stack of legal documents resting near the gravy boat. I looked at my smug brother, and then I simply smiled at him. Naomi took my smile as a sign of shock. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive mahogany table, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the antique chandelier. She let out a soft, condescending laugh and picked up her wine glass. "I already have an interior designer coming in on Tuesday morning, Audrey," she said, taking a small sip of her drink. That corner office of yours has always been so incredibly drab and lifeless. It needs a complete overhaul now that a real executive is moving in. We are thinking rich mahogany wood accents, leather seating, and maybe a custom wet bar in the corner. Brandon needs a space that commands respect when he brings in high-profile clients. You understand, do you not? It is just business. I said absolutely nothing. I simply reached for the serving spoon and calmly added another scoop of sweet potato casserole to my plate. The utter lack of panic on my face seemed to severely irritate my sister-in-law. She clearly wanted tears. She wanted me to beg or scream or throw a glass against the wall in a fit of hysterical rage. Instead, I cut a piece of turkey, dipped it in the cranberry sauce, and took my time chewing, perfectly composed. Naomi narrowed her eyes and continued her verbal assault. Let us be brutally honest here, Audrey. You are 34 years old and completely alone. You have no husband, no children, and frankly no life outside of that dirty warehouse. It is actually incredibly sad to watch. It is time a real family man took the reins of this company. Brandon has a baby on the way. He has a legacy to build. What exactly are you building for? A collection of stray cats. I swallowed my food and looked right at her. Naomi was a highly successful real estate broker who sold multi-million-dollar homes to wealthy clients. She was smart, cutthroat, and incredibly driven. But she had made one massive miscalculation when she married my brother. She assumed our family had generational wealth. She looked at the giant suburban house, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships, and assumed Brandon was the heir to an empire. She had no idea that I was the one paying for the country club. She had no idea that Brandon was basically a trust fund kid, without an actual trust fund, surviving purely on my parents' willingness to enable his endless delusions of grandeur. You should view this as a blessing, Naomi continued, her voice dripping with fake saccharine sympathy. Brandon is going to offer you a very generous severance package out of the kindness of his heart. 2 months of your current base salary. You can take that money and finally go on a vacation. Go to Bali or Tuscany. Do one of those eat, pray, love retreats. Find yourself. Maybe find a man who can actually tolerate a woman with such a rigid and masculine energy. Because sitting behind a desk running a logistics company has clearly done nothing for your personal life. My mother nodded enthusiastically from the other end of the table. Naomi is entirely right, sweetheart. We are doing this for your own good, so please do not be difficult. You have been looking so tired and aged lately. Those dark circles under your eyes are just terrible. Now you can focus on softening up a bit. Maybe join my gardening club or take a cooking class. I took another slow, deliberate bite of my dinner. The turkey was incredibly dry, but the psychological warfare happening at this table was delicious. They were all waiting for the massive emotional explosion. My father sat back with his arms crossed, playing the role of the silent, powerful patriarch who had just orchestrated the master stroke of the century. He honestly thought he had outsmarted me using the very company I bled for to set up his golden boy for life. Brandon smirked, tapping his fingers aggressively on the table. So are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way, Audrey? I have a private security team ready to box up your personal items this weekend. You do not even have to come into the building and embarrass yourself. Just hand over your company laptop and the office keys right now, and we can finish this nice Thanksgiving dinner as a family. No hard feelings. I carefully placed my fork and knife down on my plate, laying them perfectly parallel to each other. I picked up my linen napkin and politely dabbed the corners of my mouth. The silence in the dining room stretched tight like a rubber band about to snap. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I looked at the stack of legal documents resting near the gravy boat one more time. The legal transfer of ownership, the 51% majority share. The sacred piece of paper they thought was their golden ticket to the immense wealth I had built from the ground up over 10 agonizing years. I looked back at Naomi, whose perfectly contoured face was frozen in an expression of arrogant triumph. She really believed she was going to be the wife of a millionaire chief executive officer by Monday morning. She had already spent the corporate money in her head. She had already envisioned the elite private school for her unborn child, the luxury European vacations, and the undeniable social status of running EcoShift Logistics. It was almost a shame to ruin her perfectly crafted fantasy. Almost. It was almost a shame to ruin her perfectly crafted fantasy. Almost. My father finally shifted in his leather chair, causing the antique wood to creak beneath him. He folded his large hands over his stomach and gave me a look that can only be described as victorious. For my entire life, Richard had viewed me not as a daughter, but as a highly performing asset. When I was younger, I was the trophy he paraded around when I brought home straight A grades and academic awards. When I started EcoShift Logistics, I became the reliable workhorse that generated the impressive cash flow he loved to casually mention at his exclusive country club dinners. But a daughter in his traditional eyes was never meant to wear the crown. That honor was reserved exclusively for the son. "You have to look at the bigger picture here, Audrey," my father said, his voice rumbling with false authority. "You built a nice little operation. We are all very proud of you for that. But you have reached your ceiling. You do not have the aggressive masculine instinct required to scale a national supply chain company. Brandon does. He has the vision. He has the killer instinct. We are simply stepping in to protect the family asset before you run it into the ground with your overly conservative strategies." I watched him justify the theft of my life work with the casual indifference of a man returning a slightly defective pair of shoes to a department store. He genuinely believed his own words. He believed that my 10 years of grueling labor, missing holidays, losing sleep, and fighting off corporate sharks were nothing more than a warm-up act for Brandon to step in and take the glory. My mother nodded vigorously, pouring herself another generous glass of white wine. "Your father is absolutely right," she chimed in, her jewelry clinking as she moved. "You should actually be grateful we let you play businesswoman this long. Most families would not have been so endlessly supportive of a single woman taking such massive financial risks. We gave you a beautiful sandbox to play in, Audrey. But playtime is over now. The adults need to take charge of the heavy lifting. Play businesswoman." The words hung in the air, hovering over the roasted turkey and the mashed potatoes like a foul, toxic odor. I had personally secured multi-million-dollar contracts with some of the biggest retail chains in North America. I had negotiated complex international shipping rates that saved the company millions in overhead. I had kept the lights on and the payroll funded during global supply chain crises, while Brandon was busy losing tens of thousands of dollars on digital cryptocurrency scams. And my own mother reduced all of my blood and sweat to a little girl playing in a sandbox. Naomi smirked, clearly enjoying the total dismantling of my character. She reached over and placed her manicured hand over Brandon's hand, intertwining their fingers tightly. "We are going to take such good care of your little project, Audrey," she cooed. "You do not need to worry your pretty head about logistics and supply chains anymore. You can finally rest." Brandon leaned back, resting his arm over the back of his chair, looking like a king on a cheap throne. "So what is it going to be?" he asked, his tone turning sharp and demanding. "Are you going to hand over the keys right now and walk away with your dignity, or are we going to have to make a massive scene on Monday morning? Because I promise you, I have absolutely zero problem having my private security team carry your cardboard boxes out to the parking lot in front of your former employees." The arrogance in the dining room was so thick you could cut it with a steak knife. They honestly believed they had cornered me. They thought they had outsmarted the workhorse. They had taken the 51% control and stripped me of my own company. Or so they desperately wanted to believe. I did not break eye contact with my arrogant brother. I reached down and picked up my white linen napkin, pressing it gently to the corners of my mouth. I placed it neatly beside my dinner plate, making sure the edges were perfectly aligned. I picked up my crystal glass of Cabernet, holding it delicately by the stem, and took a long, slow sip. The wine was rich, heavy, and tasted like absolute victory. I set the glass down on the coaster. I turned my head slowly, shifting my gaze away from Brandon, away from Naomi, and away from my mother. I locked my eyes directly onto my father. The man who orchestrated this entire corporate coup, thinking I was too blind to see it coming. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I watched the smug satisfaction slowly begin to drain from his wrinkled face as he realized I was not crying. I was not screaming. I was not begging on my knees for my job. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany table, and tilted my head. Should I tell them now? I asked, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. Or do you want to? The entire room went dead silent. My father let out a harsh bark of laughter that echoed loudly off the high dining room ceiling. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair, and crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at me like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. He did not look intimidated at all. He thought I was just a desperate woman trying to cling to her dignity before being literally thrown out into the street. There is nothing to tell, Audrey, my father said in a deep, booming voice that he always used to intimidate people. You can try to spin this however you want, but the facts are right here in black and white. The paperwork is completely ironclad. I had my personal lawyers draw it up and review it. You are out. Brandon is in. Brandon. That is the end of the story. So accept reality. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table, and locked eyes with me. Let me remind you how this business actually started. 5 years ago, you came crying to me because the bank refused to approve your commercial lease for that first warehouse. You had no credit history and no real assets. You were completely stuck. I am the one who stepped up. I co-signed that $50,000 loan to get you off the ground. My mother nodded, sipping her expensive white wine. We saved you from total financial ruin before you even started, she added very helpfully. My father pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at me. Exactly. And in exchange for taking on that financial risk, I made sure my name was placed on the original operating agreement of EcoShift Logistics, LLC. I legally owned a 51% controlling interest from day one. I let you run the day-to-day operations. But make no mistake, Audrey, I have always been the majority owner, and I have the absolute legal right to transfer my shares to my son. He spoke with such absolute, unshakable conviction. He genuinely believed that a $50,000 loan from half a decade ago gave him the right to steal a company now worth millions. He conveniently left out the part where I paid back every single penny of that loan within the first 2 years. He left out the fact that I paid the massive interest rates. He left out the fact that I was the one who worked those 90-hour weeks sleeping on a cheap cot in a freezing warehouse. In his mind, his mere signature on a bank document was worth more than my literal blood, sweat, and tears. Brandon smiled a wide, greedy smile that showed all his perfectly white teeth. He reached out and placed his hand flat on top of the legal transfer document resting next to the gravy boat. He slowly slid the thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my plate. Read it and weep, Sister, Brandon mocked, tapping the top page with his index finger. The state has already processed the transfer. It is a done deal. You do not have a leg to stand on. If you try to fight this in court, my lawyers will bleed you dry until you cannot even afford to buy groceries. So take the severance pay pack up your little desk plants and disappear. Do not ruin this holiday for us. Naomi chimed in, looking at her perfectly manicured nails with a bored expression. You really should listen to them, Audrey. It is honestly pathetic to watch you try to act tough. You are a single woman with zero leverage. Brandon is the future of this family. Just sign whatever you need to sign, and let us finish this beautiful Thanksgiving meal in peace. I'm absolutely starving, and this tension is terrible for the baby. I looked down at the document sitting perfectly aligned with my dinner plate. The official seal of the state was stamped directly on the front page. The signatures of my father and my brother were scribbled at the bottom in thick blue ink. They had executed the transfer perfectly according to the strict letter of the law regarding limited liability companies. They thought they had trapped me in a flawless legal cage. They thought they had outsmarted me using the very corporate structure I had built to protect myself. I did not touch the paper. I did not even look at it for more than a few fleeting seconds. I just kept looking at my father, who was busy cutting a piece of roasted turkey, looking thoroughly satisfied with his grand master plan. He had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. I slowly reached down beside my chair and picked up my leather tote bag. I unzipped the top compartment and pulled out my tablet device. The polished screen reflected the warm glow of the dining room chandelier. I did not rush. I took my time, wiping a small smudge off the glass before entering my passcode. I tapped the mail icon and scrolled down through my sent folder until I found a very specific message. It was a company-wide memo I had sent exactly 3 weeks ago. I placed the tablet flat on the table right next to the thick stack of transfer documents Brandon had just shoved in my face. I spun the screen around so it was facing him perfectly. "Read it," I said softly. Brandon rolled his eyes, leaning forward with an exaggerated sigh, like I was wasting his incredibly valuable time. He looked down at the bright screen. Naomi leaned over his shoulder, her diamond earrings swaying as she narrowed her eyes to read the text. My father stopped chewing his turkey and frowned, suddenly annoyed that his flawless victory lap was being interrupted by a digital screen. Brandon began to read the email out loud. His voice started off flat, but quickly grew increasingly amused. "To the entire staff of EcoShift Logistics, LLC. Please be advised that effective immediately, I will no longer be serving in the capacity of Chief Executive Officer for this specific limited liability company. I will be transitioning to a new role and stepping away from the daily operations of this LLC. Thank you for your continued dedication." Brandon stopped reading and let out a loud, booming laugh. He threw his head back and laughed so hard his face turned slightly red. Naomi joined in a wide, genuine smile spreading across her perfectly contoured face. Even my father chuckled, wiping his mouth with his napkin, looking immensely satisfied. "Are you actually serious?" Brandon asked, breathlessly, pointing at the tablet. "You sent this 3 weeks ago. You already quit." My mother clapped her hands together, looking absolutely delighted. "Oh, Audrey, that is wonderful news. See, Richard? I told you she would eventually see reason. She knew she was in over her head. She knew you were going to step in and fix things, so she just bowed out gracefully. That shows a lot of maturity, sweetheart. I am actually very proud of you for recognizing your own limitations." Brandon was still laughing, shaking his head in disbelief. "I cannot believe you tried to sit here and play it cool like you were a victim. You knew this was coming. You probably saw the lawyers sniffing around and realized Dad was making his move. So you tucked your tail between your legs and sent a pathetic resignation email to the staff before we could officially fire you. You just wanted to save face in front of the warehouse workers." Naomi leaned back in her chair, looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity. "It is better this way, Audrey. Really it is. Now you do not have to suffer the embarrassment of being escorted out by security. You just quietly stepped down. That is exactly what a smart woman knowing she is beaten would do. You surrendered." My father pointed his fork at me. "This makes the transition much smoother," he declared in his booming patriarch voice. "Tomorrow morning, Brandon can just walk in and take the corner office. No fuss and no drama. You did the right thing for once, Audrey. You stepped aside for the good of the family. I let them have their moment. I let them bathe in their false victory. I let them savor the sweet taste of what they thought was my ultimate defeat. It is a rare and beautiful thing to watch arrogant people construct an entire reality based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. They thought my email was a white flag. They thought I had abandoned the castle because I saw their little army approaching over the hill." I reached out and gently pulled the tablet back toward me, shutting off the screen. The dining room fell quiet again as they waited for me to admit defeat and ask for my little severance package. They waited for the tears. They waited for the apology. I rested my hands on the table and looked directly into Brandon's eyes. I did not resign. I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the lingering tension in the room. I simply relocated my assets. Brandon's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed his face. What are you talking about? He asked, his tone suddenly defensive. You just showed me the email. You stepped down as the chief executive officer of EcoShift Logistics LLC. You admitted it right there in writing to the entire company. Yes, I did, I replied calmly. But you clearly do not understand what that actually means. Yes, I did, I replied calmly. But you clearly do not understand what that actually means for your immediate financial future. I watched Brandon stare at me with a blank expression. He had spent his entire adult life trying to get rich quick with digital coins and internet schemes, but he knew absolutely nothing about actual corporate law or how real businesses were structured. My father was equally uneducated in this specific arena. He thought owning 51% of a piece of paper made him an untouchable business tycoon. They both severely underestimated how much I had learned in the last 10 years of swimming with actual corporate sharks in the real business world. Let me give you a free business lesson, Brandon, I said, keeping my voice low and conversational. A limited liability company is essentially just a legal container. It holds whatever assets and liabilities you choose to put inside it. When I first started EcoShift Logistics 5 years ago, I put everything into that specific container. The warehouse lease, the equipment, the payroll, and eventually the lucrative client contracts. That is the specific container our father co-signed the original $50,000 loan for. That is the container he legally owned 51% of. And that is the container you just proudly transferred into your own name today. Brandon scoffed heavily and crossed his arms over his expensive suit jacket. Right. The very container that generates $15 million a year in gross revenue. Thank you for the recap, Professor. Are you done stalling now, or do you have more to share? I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. Not anymore, Brandon. 6 months ago, I realized that my proprietary supply chain software, the actual technology that makes EcoShift so incredibly valuable, was legally vulnerable. I also noticed that our father was suddenly spending an awful lot of time asking my accounting department for long-term financial projections. I saw this exact hostile family takeover coming from a mile away. So I hired a premier corporate law firm in Chicago to completely restructure my entire operation from the ground up. I did not just step down from EcoShift Logistics LLC. I legally established a brand new entity, a Delaware C corporation called EcoShift Global, and over the last 6 months I have been very busy methodically emptying out the old container. I legally transferred all of the intellectual property, including the custom routing software I coded from scratch, directly over to the new Delaware corporation. Since I was the sole creator and the old operating agreement never explicitly claimed ownership of my independent software code, that transfer was perfectly legal and completely airtight. My father dropped his silver fork. It hit his fine porcelain dinner plate with a loud, sharp clatter. What exactly are you saying to us, Audrey? He demanded, his voice suddenly stripped of its booming patriarchal confidence. I am saying that my new Delaware corporation owns the technology, I replied, keeping my tone dangerously light and pleasant. But I certainly did not stop there. Every single one of my major vendor contracts, including the massive shipping accounts with Sephora and Target, conveniently expired at the end of the third quarter. I simply chose not to renew them under the old limited liability company. Instead, I renegotiated and signed brand new multi-year contracts under EcoShift Global. My new corporation, the one I own 100% of, the one your lawyers have absolutely zero legal claim to. The dining room became so incredibly quiet that you could hear the autumn wind rustling the dead leaves outside the frosted windows. Naomi slowly lowered her wine glass to the table, her hand visibly shaking. She was a real estate broker. She understood contracts. She understood asset transfers. She was the first one to fully realize the sheer magnitude of what I had just done to her husband. Brandon looked down at the thick stack of legal transfer documents sitting proudly next to the gravy boat. He stared at the official state seal, the piece of paper he genuinely thought made him a millionaire executive. His face began to lose its color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. "You did not steal a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, Brandon," I said softly, leaning forward so he could hear every single syllable. "You stole an empty shell. The company you just claimed majority ownership of does not own the operating software. It does not own the corporate branding. And as of yesterday, it has exactly 0 active clients. There is no revenue coming in on Monday morning. There is absolutely no revenue coming in next month. You just proudly took over a completely hollowed-out corporate husk." Brandon swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk tie. He looked over at our father, who was suddenly intensely interested in the intricate wood grain of the mahogany table. But Brandon was not ready to surrender. His ego had always been his absolute biggest blind spot. He puffed out his chest and pointed an accusing finger directly at me across the table. "You are lying," he stammered, trying desperately to sound authoritative. "You cannot just take the clients and run away. Besides, the limited liability company still has massive physical assets. I have been to the industrial park, Audrey. I have walked through that 50,000 square foot facility. I know we own the entire fleet of delivery trucks. I know we own the massive automated sorting machines on the warehouse floor. You cannot fit a forklift into a new corporate filing. Those physical assets belong to the company I now control. You are just trying to scare me into handing it back." I smiled slowly, leaning back in my dining chair. I crossed my legs and looked at him with genuine cold amusement. "You are absolutely right, Brandon," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and calm. "The limited liability company you now control still holds every single one of those physical assets. You own the exclusive right to use the facility. You own the right to operate the delivery trucks. You own the expensive sorting machines." Brandon let out a loud, dramatic breath of relief, looking over at Naomi with a triumphant grin. "See," he said to his wife, "she is just bluffing us. We still have the entire infrastructure in place. We can simply hire a brand new aggressive sales team and sign new lucrative clients by the end of the month. We have the solid foundation we need." Naomi did not smile back at him. She was staring directly at me, waiting for the other shoe to drop. As a high-end real estate broker, she knew exactly how corporate leases worked. She knew I was nowhere near done. "Yes, you have the infrastructure," I agreed, reaching down into my heavy leather tote bag one more time. "But you see, Brandon, physical assets in a massive logistics business do not just exist in a vacuum. They come with corresponding massive financial obligations." I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was stuffed to the brim with official-looking documents heavily stamped with red, urgent ink. I tossed it casually onto the center of the table right next to his precious corporate transfer documents. It landed with a heavy, loud thud that made my mother flinch. "Go ahead," I offered, gesturing toward the overstuffed folder. "Open it. Take a good long look at your shiny new empire." Brandon hesitated. His manicured hand hovered over the folder for a few seconds before he finally flipped the heavy cardboard cover open. The very first page was a final legal notice from the massive commercial real estate conglomerate that owned the warehouse property. "That 50,000 square foot facility you mentioned," I said, casually taking another sip of my dark red wine. "It is not owned by the company. It is leased, and that expensive commercial lease is up for its mandatory renewal on the 1st of next month. Because the old company just lost all of its major clients, the corporate landlord is demanding a massive security deposit to renew the contract." Brandon flipped rapidly to the next page, his hands physically beginning to shake. "And those automated sorting machines you were just bragging about?" I continued, my voice ringing clear through the silent room. "They require mandatory annual maintenance and strict software licensing fees, which are completely due next week. Add in the massive fleet vehicle insurance premiums, the commercial liability coverage, and the deferred state business taxes from the previous quarter." My father finally spoke up, his voice incredibly tight and strained. "How much, Audrey? Exactly how much is owed? How much is—" I looked right at my father and delivered the exact brutal number. $1.2 million, and every single penny of it is due within the next 14 days. The color completely drained from Brandon's face, leaving him looking physically ill. He stared blankly at the stack of invoices, the tax documents, and the commercial lease renewals. $1.2 million, he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. The company does not have that kind of cash lying around. I nodded slowly in complete agreement. You are absolutely correct. The old company bank account has exactly $400 left in it. I legally transferred all the operating capital to my new corporation to appropriately service my new vendor contracts, which leaves your new limited liability company entirely insolvent. Brandon looked up at me, pure, unadulterated panic swimming in his eyes. We will just declare bankruptcy then. We will dissolve the company tomorrow morning. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and gave him a terrible predatory smile. You cannot do that, Brandon. Did you even bother to read the transfer documents you signed this morning? When you eagerly accepted the 51% controlling interest and proudly named yourself the chief executive officer, you also accepted the role of primary personal guarantor for all corporate debts. The dining room was dead silent. Even my mother completely stopped breathing. That means the angry creditors will not just go after the empty company, I explained, watching his perfect world completely collapse. They are going to go after you personally. They will go after your personal bank accounts. They will go after your luxury cars. They will go after anything of immense value you currently hold. You did not just steal my company, Brandon. You volunteered to take my garbage to the dump, and you signed an ironclad contract saying you would personally pay for the absolute privilege. Naomi did not say a single word at first. She sat frozen in her expensive dining chair, staring at the mountain of invoices and legal notices I dropped onto the table. Her eyes darted between the numbers printed in bold red ink and the terrified face of her husband. As a luxury real estate broker, Naomi dealt with commercial contracts, zoning laws, and complex financial liabilities every single day. She knew how to read the fine print better than anyone else in this room. She knew a death sentence when she saw one. Suddenly, Naomi lunged across the table. Her manicured hand snatched the thick stack of transfer documents right out from under Brandon's trembling fingers. She pulled the paperwork toward her and began flipping frantically through the pages of the operating agreement that our father had paid his expensive lawyers to draft. Her eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs with brutal efficiency, looking for the specific clauses governing the assumption of corporate debt. Brandon tried to take the papers back. Naomi, he stammered, his voice weak. Stop it. You do not need to look at those. We just need to figure out a new strategy. Naomi swatted his hand away. Shut your mouth, Brandon, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Do not say another word until I finish reading this. My mother shifted uncomfortably, looking back and forth between her golden boy and his furious wife. Naomi. Dear, please lower your voice, my mother pleaded, trying to maintain her fragile illusion of control. Richard will call his legal team on Monday, and we will get this sorted out. Audrey is just trying to intimidate us. Naomi ignored my mother completely. She reached the fourth page of the transfer agreement, and her finger stopped dead on a specific paragraph. Her face turned an ashen shade of gray. She slowly lifted her head and looked directly at my father. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute disbelief and raw, mounting fury. You absolute idiot, Naomi whispered, staring at my father like he was a stranger. You let him sign a full assumption of liability clause. You transferred the majority ownership without conducting a single audit of the corporate accounts. You handed your son a financial live grenade and told him it was a gold mine. My father puffed out his chest, trying to regain dominance. I secured the family legacy, he barked defensively. The infrastructure alone is worth millions. We will just restructure the debt. It is standard business practice, Naomi. You are overreacting. Naomi let out a dark, bitter laugh. Restructure the debt, she repeated, her voice rising. Richard, You cannot restructure a commercial lease default when the new primary guarantor has a credit score hovering around 600 because of failed crypto investments. I read these clauses every day. The corporate landlord required a personal guarantee for the facility lease. When Audrey stepped down and Brandon took over, that personal guarantee instantly transferred to him. She slammed the paperwork onto the mahogany table, pointing an accusing finger at her husband. Brandon did not just inherit a logistics company, she yelled, her professional composure shattering. He legally assumed every single penny of its outstanding debt. He is now personally on the hook for the warehouse lease, the equipment renewals, and the back taxes. They have a legally binding document that says Brandon will pay them out of his own pocket. Brandon looked physically sick. He grabbed the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. "But I do not have $1.2 million, he choked out, looking wildly around the room. "I do not have any liquid cash. Mom, you know I do not have that kind of money." Naomi stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She looked down at Brandon with an expression of pure disgust. A sickening silence fell over the room as the reality of her next words prepared to destroy their marriage. "You do not have liquid cash, Brandon," Naomi said, her voice dangerously low and trembling with rage. "But you do have assets, or at least you used to." I watched the entire chaotic scene unfold with immense quiet satisfaction, taking another very slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the financial ruin was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a physical weight pressing down on their chests, suffocating them in real time. Naomi knew exactly what those angry corporate creditors would aggressively come after first. She knew because she was the one who had helped Brandon secure it. And judging by the terrible look of pure absolute terror creeping onto Brandon's pale face, he suddenly realized exactly what she was about to reveal. Naomi turned her entire body to face her husband. The sheer panic in Brandon's eyes was no longer just about the massive corporate debt I had laid out on the table. It was about something much deeper and far more personal. He reached out, grabbing her wrist in a desperate attempt to silence her. "Please, Naomi," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Do not say it. We can fix this. Do not do this right now." She yanked her arm out of his grasp with such violent force that her crystal wine glass rattled heavily against the polished mahogany wood. "Do not touch me," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying restrained fury. "You told me this was a sure thing, Brandon. You looked me dead in the eyes and promised me that your father was handing you the keys to an absolute gold mine." My parents sat perfectly still. My mother looked down at her lap, suddenly unable to meet anyone's gaze. My father cleared his throat loudly, shifting his considerable weight in his expensive leather chair. I watched the dynamic shift in the room with absolute fascination. The united front they had so proudly displayed just 20 minutes ago was rapidly fracturing into a million jagged pieces. Naomi stood up straight, towering over Brandon, who was now physically shrinking into his seat. "Tell her what you did, Brandon," Naomi demanded, her voice rising to a dangerous pitch. "Tell your brilliant sister exactly how you managed to convince your father to hand over the majority ownership today. Because we both know Richard does not just give things away for free." Brandon squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head miserably. He was completely defeated. "Since my husband is suddenly incapable of speaking, I will tell you, Audrey," Naomi said, turning her burning gaze toward me. "2 weeks ago, Brandon came to me with this brilliant master plan. He said your father was finally ready to push you out, but Richard wanted financial security for his retirement. Brandon convinced me that if we bought out your parents' original equity stake, they would sign over the controlling interest immediately. He said it was the investment opportunity of a lifetime." I slowly set my wine glass down. A new layer of this twisted family betrayal was unfolding right before my eyes. "You bought them out?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "With what money, Naomi?" "Brandon does not have a trust fund, and he has never held a steady job for more than 6 months." Naomi let out a harsh, bitter sob that sounded like a piece of glass breaking. "We used our house," she cried out, her professional composure completely breaking down. "Brandon convinced me to take out a $300,000 second mortgage on our home. I am a real estate broker, Audrey. My entire career relies on my credit and my property investments. But I trusted my husband. We leveraged our beautiful house, and we gave all of that cash directly to your father." My father suddenly looked very uncomfortable. He reached for his water glass, avoiding my eyes. "It was a standard buyout agreement," he mumbled defensively. "Brandon wanted skin in the game. I needed to know he was serious about taking over the family legacy. It was a perfectly legitimate business transaction." "Legitimate business transaction?" Naomi screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling of the dining room. "You took $300,000 from your own son to hand him a bankrupt shell of a company. You let us mortgage our entire future to buy a mountain of commercial debt. You knew Audrey was making moves. You had to have known something was wrong. But you just wanted to cash out before the ship sank, and you let your own son go down with it." The horrific reality of the situation washed over the table. Brandon had not just accepted a toxic asset, he had paid a massive premium for it. And my parents, who loved to preach about family loyalty and legacy, had eagerly taken that money, knowing full well they were completely screwing over their favorite child just to line their own retirement accounts. "If those creditors call in the debts on Monday morning," Naomi continued, her voice trembling violently, "they are going to come after the new majority shareholder. They are going to see the equity in our home. They are going to place a lien on my property. You did not just ruin your own life, Brandon. You destroyed my business, my credit, and my home all in one single afternoon. This was supposed to be our secure future. Now it is a massive financial nightmare that will definitely haunt us forever. You absolutely disgust me. I am done." Naomi stood there, chest heaving, as she glared at the man she married. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. My mother let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hands against her cheeks. She looked at my father, expecting him to somehow magically fix this massive disaster. But my father was no longer sitting back in his chair with that smug, patriarch smile. The reality of Naomi and her furious threat had completely shattered his illusion of absolute control. Richard realized in that exact moment that the $300,000 he had quietly squeezed from his own son was entirely tied to a worthless, debt-ridden shell. He knew that if Naomi filed for divorce and the commercial creditors came knocking, that money he took for his retirement would be dragged straight into a brutal legal battle. A bankruptcy court would claw that money right back out of his personal bank account. His perfect retirement plan was suddenly a massive legal liability. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. He slammed his heavy fists onto the mahogany table, causing the fine china and the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently. He stood up, towering over the table, his chest heaving with uncontrolled anger. He did not yell at Brandon or Naomi. Instead, he turned his burning rage entirely toward me. "You did this on purpose," Richard roared, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "You planned this entire thing. You deliberately stripped the company of its most valuable assets to leave your brother holding the bag. You set us all up." I looked up at him completely unbothered. I took a slow bite of my dinner, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "I simply protected my own intellectual property and my own vendor relationships," I replied, keeping my voice calm and even. "You are the one who decided to secretly buy me out without doing a single shred of due diligence. You are the one who let your son leverage his home to buy a hollowed-out company. I did not set you up, Richard. Your own overwhelming greed set you up." My father was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for a way out of a trap. "You are not going to get away with this, Audrey," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you are so incredibly smart with your new Delaware corporation and your sneaky little asset transfers. But you forgot exactly who you are dealing with. I have the absolute best corporate lawyers in the state on my payroll." He leaned across the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, just like he had done my entire childhood. I am going to sue you for breach of fiduciary duty, he threatened, his voice booming through the dining room. As the former chief executive officer of the limited liability company, you had a strict legal obligation to act in the best financial interest of that business. Transferring all the assets and lucrative client contracts to a competing firm that you personally own is a textbook violation of the law. I will have my lawyers file an emergency injunction on Monday morning. We will freeze every single bank account your new corporation holds. We will drag you through court until you are completely bankrupt and begging for mercy. My mother nodded aggressively, her face twisted in anger. Your father will absolutely do it, Audrey, she spat. You have crossed a massive line today. You do not just steal from your own family and walk away smiling. We will take everything back. Brandon looked up, a small glimmer of desperate hope returning to his pale face. He looked at our father like a drowning man looking at a life raft. Yes, Brandon croaked, his voice weak. We will take it to court. We will prove you illegally embezzled the company assets. I sat there listening to their desperate, pathetic threats. They honestly believed they still held a winning card. They thought they could use the legal system to bully me back into submission. They thought my months of meticulous planning could be undone by a simple temper tantrum and a threat of heavy litigation. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. And then I looked at my brother. And I began to laugh. I did not just chuckle. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, loud, ringing laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 10 years walking on eggshells, suddenly realizing she was completely invincible. My laughter seemed to shock them more than the financial ruin itself. Richard stopped yelling. Susan stared at me like I had lost my mind. Brandon shrank back in his chair. You think you can sue me for breach of fiduciary duty? I asked, wiping a genuine tear of amusement from my eye. I reached back into my heavy leather tote bag. Oh, Richard, you really should pay closer attention to your own email inbox. I pulled out a single crisp piece of paper and placed it firmly on the table. It was a printed copy of a digital contract. I slid it across the smooth mahogany wood until it rested directly next to his precious transfer papers. I watched my father look down at it. His eyes darted across the bold legal heading at the top of the page. The deep purple anger in his face slowly began to curdle into pure confusion. Do you remember 2 months ago, Richard? I asked, keeping my voice conversational like we were simply discussing the weather. I bought you that all-expenses, paid luxury golf trip to Cabo San Lucas. I flew you out first class. I booked you the presidential suite at the resort. I even paid for your unlimited bar tab at the clubhouse. My father stared at me. He did not say a single word. His thick hands remained frozen on the armrests of his chair. You never even thanked me for that trip. I continued, resting my chin on my folded hands. You just assumed it was your absolute right as the patriarch to reap the lavish benefits of my hard work. You spent 5 days down there living like an absolute king on the corporate credit card, while I was back here managing a massive supply chain crisis. You even bragged to your country club friends that you were the true mastermind behind EcoShift and that you deserved the vacation. But I did not send you to Mexico because I felt generous. I sent you there because I needed you deeply distracted. Naomi let out a sharp breath, her eyes widening as she realized exactly where this was going. As a broker, she dealt with digital contracts daily. She knew how easily arrogant, wealthy men ignored the fine print when they felt invincible. On the 3rd day of your trip, you were playing the 14th hole overlooking the ocean, I said, perfectly recalling the timeline. You were at least 4 margaritas deep. I know this because you posted a very blurry picture of your cocktail on your social media account. And right at that exact moment, I sent you an email. The subject line simply said it was a routine administrative update for our annual tax filings. My father reached out with a trembling hand and slowly picked up the piece of paper. You did not want to stop playing golf to read a boring legal document, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady hum. You just wanted to clear the annoying notification off your phone so you could get back to your game. So you opened the DocuSign link, you scrolled rapidly to the very bottom, and you used your thumb to digitally sign your name. You did not read a single paragraph. But the software logged your exact Internet Protocol address, your geographic location in Cabo, and the precise second you legally bound yourself to those terms. Richard was completely silent. His eyes were scanning the text on the page, moving frantically back and forth like a trapped animal looking for a way out. "Read the second paragraph out loud for the table, Richard," I instructed, leaning back in my dining chair. He did not speak. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter right there in his mouth. "Fine, I will read it for you," I said, reciting the legal clause from memory. "The majority shareholder hereby explicitly authorizes the unrestricted transfer of all intellectual property, custom software architecture, and existing vendor contracts from EcoShift Logistics to EcoShift Global. Furthermore, the majority shareholder permanently waives any right to contest this transfer, litigate against the founder, or claim breach of fiduciary duty in any future legal proceedings." My mother gasped loudly, clutching the pearls at her neck. "Richard," she whispered, her voice filled with absolute terror. "Tell me you did not sign that. Tell me she is lying to us." My father slowly lowered the piece of paper. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had just violently threatened to destroy my life was completely gone. He looked like a deflated balloon. The document in his hand was an ironclad, legally binding waiver. His own expensive corporate lawyers would take one single look at that digital signature and tell him he had absolutely no case. He had voluntarily surrendered his only weapon. "You gave me the keys to the castle while you were getting drunk on a golf course?" I said, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. "You explicitly approved the entire asset transfer. You legally signed away your right to sue me. There will be no emergency injunction on Monday morning. There will be no massive lawsuit. You have absolutely no legal recourse. I made sure my legal team bulletproofed that waiver specifically for this exact moment." Brandon looked like he was about to be physically sick. He turned to our father, his eyes wide with desperate, pathetic pleading. "Dad," he choked out, his voice shaking. "Tell me we can fight this. Tell me you have a plan to fix this." But Richard had nothing. He had spent his entire life treating me like a naive little girl who existed only to serve his grand vision. He never respected my intellect, and that fatal flaw had just cost him everything. He just stared blankly at the printed certificate resting on the table, realizing he had walked directly into his own slaughterhouse. He thought he was playing a master game of corporate chess, but he had not even realized we were on an entirely different board. Brandon refused to accept the horrifying reality of the situation unfolding before him. He reached up and aggressively loosened his expensive silk tie, pulling at his tight collar. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops of moisture gathering on his pale forehead. His terrified eyes darted wildly around the formal dining room, desperately searching for a magical escape hatch from the absolute financial nightmare he had just willingly signed up for. He looked over at our father, who was still staring blankly at the signed legal waiver in total defeat. He looked across the table at Naomi, who actively glared back at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This is a massive, elaborate bluff," Brandon suddenly shouted, his voice shrill and entirely panicked. "You cannot just illegally steal the valuable client roster like that. They exclusively signed up with EcoShift Logistics. They completely trust the established brand name and the massive physical infrastructure. You honestly think you can just magically make the biggest retail clients in the entire country disappear into thin air? I am directly calling Gregory right now to completely prove you wrong in front of everyone." Gregory was the vice president of regional supply chain for Target. He was our largest single corporate account, directly responsible for nearly 40% of our annual gross revenue. It was a massive multi-million-dollar contract I had personally secured. Brandon quickly shoved his trembling right hand deep into his tailored suit pocket and violently pulled out his heavy smartphone. He frantically scrolled through his long list of business contacts until he finally found the correct corporate directory number. He forcefully tapped the glowing glass screen and immediately hit the loud speakerphone button so the entire family could clearly hear his impending triumph. He angrily slammed the phone down right next to his half-eaten dinner plate. The line began to ring. The sound echoed loudly in the silent room. My mother leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together in a silent prayer. Naomi crossed her arms completely unconvinced. I picked up my silver fork and took another bite of my sweet potato casserole, enjoying the live entertainment. The line clicked. "This is Gregory," a professional voice said. "Gregory, my man!" Brandon yelled, leaning over his phone, projecting absolute confidence. "It is Brandon. I am calling to introduce myself as the new majority shareholder and chief executive officer of EcoShift Logistics. My father and I officially took over today. I wanted to personally assure you that your account will receive top-tier priority. We will aggressively scale our operations to serve you better." There was a very long, uncomfortable pause on the other end. The heavy silence stretched for so long that Brandon nervously tapped his knuckles against the table. "I am sorry," Gregory finally said, his tone utterly confused. "Who exactly is this?" Brandon's fake smile faltered. "It is Brandon," he repeated, losing his swagger. "Richard is my father. Audrey is my sister. I am the new chief executive officer of EcoShift Logistics." Another heavy pause followed. When Gregory spoke again, his voice was icy. "Listen, Brandon. I have absolutely no idea who you are. Target does not hold any active contracts with an entity called EcoShift Logistics, LLC. Brandon's face turned a sickening shade of gray. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, a cold sweat breaking out. "We process millions of units for your retail stores every quarter. We did have a commercial contract with that limited liability company," Gregory corrected him, growing annoyed. "But that contract expired 30 days ago. We chose not to renew it. We recently signed a brand new exclusive 5-year distribution agreement with a completely different corporate organization called EcoShift Global. Audrey is our sole point of contact and the only person my board completely trusts." Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a helpless fish. "I do not know what kind of messy family drama you have going on," Gregory continued, completely impatient. "I highly suggest you stop calling my personal cell phone with these fraudulent claims. If you have further questions, contact our legal department on Monday. Have a good evening." The line went dead immediately. A sharp, piercing beep echoed through the dining room, signaling the end. Brandon stared blindly at the dark black screen of his phone. The tiny digital speaker had just ruthlessly delivered the final fatal blow to his fragile ego. He had desperately tried to assert dominance over my successful logistics empire, and instead he was brutally humiliated by the exact corporate client he foolishly thought he owned. He had absolutely nothing left in the world. He was a pathetic fake executive sitting frozen at a holiday dinner table, holding the massive, suffocating legal debts of a completely worthless, ruined company. The heavy silence that followed the phone call was suddenly shattered by the sound of breaking glass. My mother had jumped up from her chair so violently that she knocked her crystal water goblet onto the floor. The expensive glass shattered into dozens of jagged pieces across the hardwood, but she did not even look down. Susan was staring at me with a look of pure, unhinged hatred. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly out of place and her face was flushed with frantic maternal rage. She could not stand seeing her precious golden boy sitting there completely broken and humiliated. "You are a thief," my mother screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. Her voice was shrill and completely devoid of her usual country club elegance. "You are a disgusting, selfish thief, Audrey. You manipulated your own father. You stole the family business right out from under us, and now you are trying to destroy your brother's life just because you are jealous of him. You have always been jealous of him. I will personally make sure you go to jail for this. We are going to call the police and tell them you embezzled millions of dollars from the family company." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my heavy leather tote bag for the third and final time. "Am I the embezzler, Mother?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Let us take a look at the actual accounting records before you decide to dial emergency services. I pulled out a thick, bright red folder and slapped it down onto the mahogany table. It landed right on top of the useless corporate transfer documents and the massive pile of commercial debt notices. What is that? My father demanded, his voice lacking all of its previous booming authority. He was staring at the red folder like it was a live explosive device. That, Richard the First said, tapping the heavy cardboard cover, is the complete uncensored transaction history of the secondary corporate credit card for EcoShift Logistics. The specific card you secretly demanded I issue to Brandon 2 years ago so he could, quote, entertain potential vendors, unquote. You told me it was a necessary business expense to train him for an executive role. I strongly advised against it, but as the majority shareholder, you forced my hand. Brandon's head snapped up. The sickly gray color of his face instantly drained into a ghostly absolute white. He knew exactly what was inside that red folder. I opened the cover and pulled out the first page of the highlighted bank statements. I did not even need to look at the numbers because I had memorized them months ago. Would you like to hear how your brilliant son has been entertaining our vendors? I asked, looking directly at my mother, who was still standing rigid by her chair. Let us review his highly professional executive expenses. Last March, he charged $14,000 at a VIP nightclub in Miami. He expensed it as a client dinner. I checked our corporate logs, and we do not have a single vendor or client located within 500 miles of Miami. Naomi whipped her head around to glare at Brandon. Miami, she hissed, her voice lethal. You told me you were at a logistics conference in Atlanta last March. I flipped to the next page. In July, he initiated a direct corporate wire transfer of $35,000 to an offshore digital currency exchange. He categorized it in the accounting software as an international freight tariff. He used company money to buy unregulated crypto tokens, which completely collapsed in value 3 days later. That is $35,000 of operating capital gone instantly. Brandon buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled groan. And my absolute personal favorite, I continued, pulling out a glossy receipt from a luxury boutique. Last Christmas, he used the corporate card to purchase a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet. He classified it as a year-end bonus for a top-tier warehouse manager. I looked directly at Naomi. She was wearing a very nice watch, but she was definitely not wearing a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet. She realized it at the exact same moment. Her eyes widened and she looked at Brandon with a level of disgust that could melt solid steel. He had used company money to buy expensive jewelry for another woman, while simultaneously begging his wife to take out a second mortgage on their family home. My father sat entirely frozen. Even he did not know the full extent of Brandon's financial abuse. He had enabled his son, but he had never bothered to actually check the ledgers. You want to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, Richard? I asked, turning my attention back to the defeated patriarch. You want to drag my new Delaware corporation into a lengthy legal discovery process. Go right ahead. File the paperwork on Monday morning. But the exact second your lawyers file that suit, I am taking this bright red folder and I am handing it directly to the Internal Revenue Service. My mother slowly sank back down into her chair, completely defeated. The federal government does not play games with corporate tax fraud. I explained, my voice cold and absolute. Co-mingling personal luxury expenses with corporate accounts and writing them off as tax deductions is a massive federal crime. If you sue me, the IRS audits the old limited liability company. They will immediately see that the new chief executive officer has been routinely embezzling thousands of dollars. Brandon will not just lose the company. He will not just lose his house. He will be sitting in a federal prison cell for wire fraud and tax evasion. So tell me, Richard, do you still want to call your lawyers? Richard did not answer me. He slowly lowered his eyes to the table, staring blankly at the polished wood. The great patriarch of the family, the man who had ruled our household with an iron fist for decades, had completely surrendered. He knew I had him perfectly cornered. If he tried to protect his own ego by fighting me in court, he would send his favorite son directly to a federal penitentiary. The illusion of our perfect wealthy family finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there over the Thanksgiving turkey. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the heavy, ragged breathing coming from Brandon. He was staring at the glossy receipt for the diamond tennis bracelet like it was a venomous snake about to strike him. But the strike did not come from the receipt. It came directly from his furious wife. Naomi stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She did not even flinch at the noise. She stepped toward Brandon, her entire body vibrating with a terrifying cold rage. "My family warned me about you," Naomi said, her voice dangerously low and dangerously steady. "When I first brought you home to meet my parents in Atlanta, my father took one look at you and told me exactly what you were. My brothers told me you were nothing but a lazy, entitled little boy pretending to be a man. They saw right through your expensive tailored suits and your elite country club membership. They told me you completely lacked the fundamental work ethic to ever provide for a family." Brandon looked up at her, his eyes begging for mercy. "Naomi, please," he whispered. "Let us just go home and talk about this in private. I can easily explain everything." "Explain what?" Naomi shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Explain how you mortgaged our entire future for a bankrupt shell. Explain how you let your brilliant sister do all the hard work for 10 years while you played pretend executive. Or do you want to explain the $12,000 diamond bracelet you bought for someone else while I was paying our residential mortgage out of my own real estate commissions?" She grabbed her water glass from the table and threw the ice-cold liquid directly into his pale, sweating face. Brandon gasped, shrinking back into his chair as the water dripped down his nose and completely soaked his pristine white collar. "You are a complete fraud, Brandon," Naomi spat, glaring down at him with absolute disgust. "You have absolutely nothing to offer a successful woman like me. I built my career from the ground up. I worked my entire life to secure my financial independence. And you manipulated me into handing it all over to your greedy father so you could finally feel like a big, important chief executive officer. You are entirely pathetic." My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She had never seen anyone speak to her precious golden boy this way. But she was too terrified of the Internal Revenue Service threat to actually intervene. Naomi did not even glance at my mother. Instead, she slowly turned her burning, furious gaze away from her humiliated husband and locked eyes with my father. Richard was still staring down at the table, trying to make himself look as small as physically possible. "You listen to me, Richard," Naomi demanded, stepping closer to the head of the dining table. "I do not care about your fake corporate transfer documents. I do not care about your stupid legal threats against Audrey. And I definitely do not care about this pathetic excuse for a son you raised. I only care about one thing right now." My father slowly looked up, his face pale and incredibly haggard. "I want my $300,000 back," Naomi said, her voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You took that money from me knowing exactly what was happening. You knew this logistics company was unstable. You knew your daughter was the only one actually holding it together. But you eagerly took my hard-earned money anyway to pad your own luxury retirement account. We can discuss the complicated finances later." Naomi, my father mumbled, trying to sound diplomatic but completely failing. "This is a family holiday. Let us all just calm down and look at the exact numbers on Monday morning. We are not discussing anything later." Naomi snapped, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated fury. "You are going to write me a certified check for $300,000 right now. If you do not wire that money back into my account by tomorrow morning, I will personally call the commercial landlord of that warehouse and tell them exactly what your son just did. I will call the bank that holds the corporate credit card and report the fraud myself. I will burn this entire fake family to the ground to get my house back. Do you understand me, Richard?" My father stared at the furious woman standing at the end of his dining table. For a fleeting second, he looked like an old defeated man. But then a very familiar shift happened. The narcissistic pride that had governed his entire life violently kicked back in. He was a man who demanded absolute respect, and he was not about to let his daughter-in-law scream at him in his own house. Richard slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, puffing out his chest to regain his physical dominance in the room. He looked down his nose at Naomi with an expression of cold, calculating arrogance. "I understand that you are highly emotional right now, Naomi," my father said, his voice returning to that deep, booming register. "But you will not stand in my dining room and threaten me. You will not speak to me like I am some common criminal who stole your purse. I want my money back." Naomi repeated, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "It was not a request, Richard. It was a demand." My father let out a short, dismissive scoff. He reached for his crystal water glass, taking a slow sip before answering her. "I am not giving you a single penny back," he stated plainly. The room seemed to plunge into an absolute freezing temperature. Brandon looked up with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad," he pleaded, "you have to give it back to her. We are going to lose our house." "Shut up, Brandon," my father snapped without even looking at him. He turned his attention back to Naomi. "Let us be very clear about what happened here. Your husband approached me with a buyout offer. He wanted the controlling interest of a multi-million-dollar logistics infrastructure. He presented me with a contract. I signed the contract and he wired the funds. It was a completely fair business transaction between two consenting adult men. It is not my fault that your husband is a complete financial idiot." Naomi stepped back as if she had been physically struck. "You knew the company was deeply in debt," she said, her voice shaking. "You knew it was a hollow shell." My father shrugged his shoulders, his face entirely devoid of guilt or remorse. "I knew the commercial lease was coming up for renewal," he admitted casually. "I knew Audrey was aggressively restructuring the vendor contracts. But in the corporate world, it is the absolute legal responsibility of the buyer to conduct extensive due diligence before acquiring a major asset. Brandon did absolutely zero research. He did not hire an independent auditor. He did not request the updated tax ledgers. He just blindly handed me a check because his massive ego convinced him he could run a company better than his sister. That is his own personal failure. I am not a charity, Naomi. I am a retired businessman. That $300,000 is already securely locked away in an irrevocable retirement trust fund. You cannot touch it, and I am certainly not returning it just because you two made a terrible real estate gamble." I watched Naomi process the sheer absolute magnitude of his betrayal. She slowly turned her head and looked at my mother. Susan was staring intently at her plate, completely refusing to make eye contact with the woman whose life they had just intentionally ruined. Susan was entirely complicit. She was perfectly happy to sacrifice her son and his pregnant wife if it meant securing her own luxury retirement lifestyle. The illusion of the wealthy, respectable suburban family evaporated into thin air. Naomi finally saw them exactly the way I had seen them for the last 20 years. They were parasites. They wore expensive clothes and lived in a beautiful manicured home, but they fed on the hard work and financial stability of anyone they could sink their teeth into. First, they fed on me. And when I finally cut off their supply, they eagerly turned around and fed on their own golden boy. "You are monsters," Naomi whispered, shaking her head in total disbelief. "Both of you. You raised a lazy, entitled fraud, and then you completely robbed him blind." She let out a dry, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. "I used to wonder why Audrey always kept her distance from this family. I used to think she was just cold and difficult. But you people are a completely toxic infection. You actively destroy everything you touch." Naomi slowly reached down and picked up her expensive designer handbag from the floor. She did not look frantic anymore. She looked terrifyingly calm. "I am going to call my lawyers on Monday morning," she announced, her voice ringing clear and steady. "I am filing for an emergency divorce, and I am instructing my legal team to aggressively subpoena those retirement trust records. You might think you executed a brilliant corporate buyout, Richard, but you knowingly committed financial fraud to extract equity from my personal property. I will drag this entire fake family through the absolute mud." My father could not even form a coherent response. He just stared at Naomi as she clutched her designer handbag, standing there like a ticking time bomb. The sheer aggressive force of her threat completely paralyzed him. But while my father was retreating into a state of shocked silence, my mother suddenly realized that brute force and legal threats were absolutely useless against me. She realized they were completely out of ammunition, so she instantly pivoted to the only weapon she had left in her entire arsenal: emotional manipulation. Susan let out a loud, theatrical sob that echoed sharply in the quiet dining room. Her shoulders began to violently shake, and she buried her face in her hands. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before. Growing up, whenever my mother was losing an argument or getting caught in a lie, she would instantly transform herself into a helpless victim. She would cry until the other person felt so incredibly guilty they simply apologized just to make the tears stop. "Audrey, please," she wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "Please look at what is happening to our family. We are completely falling apart right before my eyes on Thanksgiving." She pushed her chair back and slowly walked over to my side of the table. She reached out with her perfectly manicured hands and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was desperate and tight. I did not pull away. I just sat there looking at the fake tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks. "You have made your point, Audrey," my mother cried out, her voice dripping with desperation. "You proved that you are the smartest person in the room. You proved that your father underestimated you, and you proved that Brandon needs you. We completely admit it. You won. But please, you cannot let your own brother go to federal prison. You cannot let Naomi lose her home. You have such a good heart, Audrey. You have always been the sensible one." I stared at her completely unmoved. Sensible was just the word she used when she wanted me to quietly absorb their toxic behavior without complaining. "You need to be the bigger person here," my mother begged, squeezing my arm tighter. "I know you are angry, but you have to forgive us. You can fix this. You can call your lawyers on Monday and merge your new corporation back into the original company. You can bring the massive client contracts back. If you do that, the commercial debt will be easily covered. We can pay Naomi back her $300,000, and everything can just go back to normal." I slowly reached over and removed her hands from my arm. "Go back to normal," I repeated, my voice incredibly flat. "You mean go back to me working 90-hour weeks to fund Brandon's luxury lifestyle? You mean go back to me being the invisible workhorse while he gets paraded around the country club as the brilliant young executive?" My mother shook her head frantically, fresh tears spilling from her eyes. "No, Audrey. It will be completely different now," she pleaded. "Your father and I will make sure Brandon respects you. We will make sure you get the proper credit. But you cannot just walk away and destroy him. You are breaking your mother's heart, Audrey. I raised you to value family above money. How can you sit there drinking wine while your own flesh and blood faces complete financial ruin?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself before delivering what she thought was her ultimate emotional masterstroke. "You have to look at the bigger picture, Audrey," she whispered, her voice thick with fake emotion. "You are 34 years old. You have no husband. You have no children. You chose your career over starting a family, and that is fine. But Brandon is having a baby. He is the one carrying on the family name. Brandon is your family legacy. You cannot punish an innocent unborn child just because you are holding on to some petty resentment. You have to sacrifice this for the greater good of our family bloodline." Naomi let out a sharp sound of pure disgust from the other end of the table. "Do not you dare use my unborn child as a pawn to save your worthless son, Susan," she spat. My baby is not a bargaining chip to get you out of federal tax fraud. If my child is his only legacy, then his legacy is entirely built on lies and stolen money. Do not speak for my child ever again. There it was, the absolute ugliest truth of my entire existence laid bare on the Thanksgiving table. In my mother's eyes, my life had absolutely no inherent value because I was not providing an heir to the family name. My massive corporate success, my intelligence, my independence, none of it mattered. I was just a barren branch on the family tree, expected to kindly snap off and turn myself into firewood to keep my brother's house warm. Brandon looked up from his hands, his eyes red and puffy. "Please, Audrey," he croaked out, sounding like a pathetic child. "I will do whatever you want. I will give you the title back. Just merge the companies. Do it for the baby." I looked at the three of them. My father still paralyzed in his chair, my brother begging like a coward, my mother using her unborn grandchild as a human shield to protect her golden boy. They honestly thought the heavy weight of family guilt would finally break my spine. They thought I would surrender my entire empire just to prove I was a good daughter. They were so incredibly wrong. I pushed my chair back very slowly and stood up from the Thanksgiving table. The antique hardwood floor creaked softly beneath me. I looked down at my mother, whose face was still stained with those entirely manufactured tears. I looked at my father, who was still slouching in total defeat, his heavy shoulders sagging under the weight of his own monumental arrogance. And finally, I looked at my brother, who was staring up at me with the desperate, pathetic eyes of a completely broken man. "I am not angry, Mother," I began, my voice perfectly steady and resonant in the quiet room. "Anger requires a level of emotional investment that I simply no longer possess for any of you. What I feel right now is absolute profound clarity." My mother opened her mouth to speak again, to launch into another pathetic wailing session, but I immediately raised my hand, slicing through the air with sharp, absolute authority. "You will not speak right now," I commanded. "You have spent my entire life telling me exactly what my place is. Tonight you are going to sit there and listen to me." I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. For 10 agonizing years, I have been the designated draft horse of this family. I pulled the heavy plow through the mud while Brandon paraded around the show ring wearing blue ribbons he never actually earned. I sacrificed my entire youth for that company. I missed my own birthdays. I slept on a freezing concrete warehouse floor during the winter of our second year to ensure the heating system did not break and destroy our entire inventory. I fought ruthlessly with international suppliers. I navigated devastating global shipping strikes entirely on my own. I built an absolute fortress of wealth from nothing but dirt and pure sheer determination. I paused, standing directly behind Brandon's chair. He stiffened visibly, his shoulders hiking up to his ears, but he did not dare turn around to face me. "And what was my reward for all that blood and sweat?" I asked the silence. Every single time I achieved a massive corporate milestone, Richard would casually take all the credit at his exclusive country club dinners. He would tell his rich friends that he was the mastermind. And you, Susan, you would constantly pull me aside and tell me not to brag about my massive profit margins because it might make Brandon feel deeply insecure about his latest failed internet venture. I was expected to continuously shrink myself to make him look taller. I was expected to hide my brilliance so his absolute staggering mediocrity would not look so painfully obvious to the rest of the world. I walked back to my side of the table, looking down at the lavish Thanksgiving feast that was now growing completely cold and unappetizing. It looked exactly like our family. Beautiful and perfect on the absolute surface, but entirely dead and cold underneath. You look at my life and you see a barren woman with no legacy because I do not have a child, I said, locking eyes with my mother. You think my existence is somehow tragic, but you are completely blind to reality. My legacy is a multi-million-dollar international supply chain network. My legacy is the absolute financial independence that allows me to stand in this room and watch the three of you panic because you can no longer financially control me. I do not need a husband or a biological child to validate my existence in this world. And I certainly do not need to sacrifice my hard-earned empire to act as a permanent financial safety net for a 31-year-old man-child who cannot even balance a basic corporate ledger. Brandon flinched violently at the insult, but he kept his eyes glued to the expensive rug. Naomi, who was still standing near the edge of the room, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of total agreement. You wanted to be the chief executive officer, Brandon, I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. You wanted the prestigious corner office and the massive salary and the unearned respect. Well, congratulations. You officially have the title. You eagerly signed the paperwork. But a real executive does not cry and beg his sister to fix his monumental mistakes. A real executive deals with the angry commercial landlord. A real executive faces the federal tax auditors. You wanted the heavy crown so desperately, and now you get to feel exactly how much it weighs as it snaps your neck. I turned my fierce gaze back to my parents. I will never merge my Delaware corporation back into your worthless, bankrupt shell. I will never bring my loyal clients back to an entity controlled by people who willingly steal from their own blood. You can cry, and you can scream, and you can try to manipulate me with the sacred concept of family loyalty. But family loyalty is a two-way street. You burned the bridge, you completely salted the earth, and now you are crying because you have absolutely nothing left to eat. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my silk blouse. I am officially done. I am completely done being your workhorse. I am done funding this toxic, sickening illusion of a perfect family. You created this massive financial disaster entirely on your own, and you will survive it on your own. My legacy is walking out that front door and never looking back. I picked up my designer purse from the floor beside my chair. The heavy silence in the dining room was absolute. My father stared blankly at the wall. My brother stared miserably at the floor. Naomi was still clutching her handbag, looking like she was ready to go to war and burn the entire house down. I turned on my heel, the sound of my shoes sharp against the polished wood, and took my first step toward the grand foyer. I was finally leaving this toxic prison for good. And then the doorbell rang. The loud electronic chime echoed through the massive house, cutting violently through the suffocating tension. It was exactly 8 o'clock at night on Thanksgiving. Nobody expected any guests. The sudden sharp noise made Brandon jump out of his chair like he had been physically shocked. My father blinked rapidly, pulling himself out of his defeated stupor. For a brief second, everyone just stared at the wide archway leading to the front door, completely paralyzed by the unexpected interruption. My mother was the first to react. Susan had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of sweeping massive family traumas directly under the nearest expensive rug. The doorbell was her ultimate salvation. It was a golden excuse to instantly stop talking about federal tax fraud, corporate bankruptcy, and stolen retirement funds. She desperately needed an audience to play her absolute favorite role of the perfect wealthy suburban hostess. "Oh my goodness," Susan gasped loudly, her voice suddenly shifting an entire octave higher. "That must be the neighbors. The Harrisons said they might drop by after dinner to bring us some of their famous homemade pecan pie. We absolutely cannot let them see us looking like this." She moved with terrifying speed. Susan frantically wiped the remaining fake tears from her cheeks using the back of her hands. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress and aggressively patted her perfectly styled hair back into place. She took a deep breath, physically forcing her facial features to rearrange themselves into a bright, welcoming smile. It was honestly chilling to witness how quickly she could switch from a weeping, manipulative victim to a glowing neighborhood socialite in less than 10 seconds. "Please, everyone, just compose yourselves," my mother hissed over her shoulder as she hurried out of the dining room toward the foyer. "Richard, fix your tie right now. Brandon, wipe your face. You are sweating profusely. We will deal with this ridiculous business nonsense after the guests leave." I stopped walking and simply stood in the archway watching her. I was not going to run away out the back door. I wanted to see exactly how she planned to act, like everything was perfectly fine while her precious family empire burned to the ground right behind her. I crossed my arms and waited. Susan reached the large double front doors. She unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door wide open, ready to loudly welcome her wealthy country club neighbors with open arms. Happy Thanksgiving, she sang out, her voice dripping with fake honey. But it was not the Harrisons standing on the front porch. There was no homemade pecan pie. The harsh porch light illuminated a single solitary figure standing in the freezing autumn air. It was a man. He looked to be in his late 40s, completely unremarkable in almost every way. He was not dressed for a festive holiday dinner. He was wearing a plain, cheap gray suit that looked slightly wrinkled from sitting in a car for too long. He had a thick, dark winter coat pulled tight against the wind, and he was holding a very thick, heavily taped manila envelope under his left arm. Susan froze, her bright smile instantly faltering. The sheer contrast between her lavish, formal dining room and the cold, professional demeanor of the stranger on her porch was completely jarring. A gust of cold wind blew a few dead autumn leaves across the marble threshold. "Oh," she stammered, taking a half step back into the house. "I am sorry. I thought you were someone else. Can I help you?" The man did not smile back. He did not offer any warm holiday greetings. He simply looked down at a small digital device in his hand, verifying the address of the massive suburban mansion. He looked back up at my mother, his expression completely blank and entirely focused on his specific task. He was clearly a man who was used to interrupting family dinners. "Good evening, Ma. Am the man," said his voice flat and perfectly practiced. "I am looking for a specific individual. Can you please confirm if this is the primary legal residence of Brandon?" My mother tightened her grip on the edge of the heavy wooden door. Her maternal instinct suddenly flared up, replacing her fake hostess persona with deep suspicion. "Who is asking?" she demanded, her voice returning to its normal, cold, defensive tone. "I am an independent contractor," the man replied, stepping slightly closer to the threshold. "I have been strictly instructed to make direct physical contact. Is he currently on the premises tonight?" Brandon, who had been nervously hovering near the dining room table, heard his name. He stepped out into the grand foyer, his face still pale and glistening with anxious sweat. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. "Who is it, Mom?" Brandon called out, walking slowly toward the open door. "What is going on?" The man in the plain suit did not even acknowledge my mother. His eyes completely bypassed her fake hostess smile and locked directly onto my brother, who was standing just a few feet away. The contractor stepped smoothly past the threshold, invading the pristine grand foyer of my parents' massive suburban home without a single ounce of hesitation. He held the thick manila envelope out in front of him like it was a loaded weapon. "Are you Brandon?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the heavy tension like a sharp knife. Brandon swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. He looked at my mother and then back at the stranger. "Yes," he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "I am Brandon. What is this about?" The man did not offer an explanation. He simply thrust the heavy envelope directly into Brandon's chest, forcing my brother to grab it before it fell to the floor. "You have officially been served," the man said, entirely devoid of emotion. "Have a pleasant Thanksgiving." Without another word, the man turned around, walked back out into the cold autumn night, and firmly pulled the heavy double doors shut behind him. The loud click of the brass deadbolt locking into place sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. Brandon stood frozen in the middle of the foyer, holding the thick envelope with both hands like it was covered in toxic poison. My mother stared at the closed door, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. My father slowly walked out of the dining room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Naomi followed closely behind him, her eyes narrowed in deep suspicion. "Open it," Richard commanded, his voice rough and completely stripped of his usual arrogant confidence. Open it right now and tell me exactly what it says. Brandon fumbled with the heavy tape sealing the top of the envelope. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the entire package. He finally managed to rip the thick paper open and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. The pages were covered in bold black text and stamped with the official seal of the State Commercial Court. Brandon stared at this first page. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the legal jargon. As he read, the remaining blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against the foyer wall just to keep himself standing upright. "What is it?" Naomi demanded, taking a step closer to him. "Stop reading it to yourself and tell us what you just got served with." "It is the landlord." Brandon choked out, his voice cracking horribly. "The commercial real estate conglomerate that owns the main warehouse. They filed an emergency legal injunction this afternoon." My father grabbed the papers directly out of Brandon's shaking hands. Richard quickly scanned the document, his face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute horror. I walked slowly out of the dining room and leaned against the doorframe, watching the final piece of my trap snap perfectly into place. "When you filed the corporate transfer documents this morning, Brandon," I said, my voice echoing calmly in the large open space, "you triggered an automatic legal clause in the commercial lease agreement. The landlord requires the primary guarantor to have a proven pristine credit history to maintain the massive square footage of that facility. You have absolutely no corporate credit history, and your personal credit score is a complete disaster due to those failed internet investments you hid from your wife." Naomi let out a sharp, bitter laugh, covering her mouth in sheer disbelief. "The automated risk assessment software flagged the transfer immediately." I continued, watching my father read the exact words I was saying. "The real estate conglomerate instantly realized the new chief executive officer was an incredibly high-risk tenant. And because they know the lucrative vendor contracts are suddenly gone, they are not taking any chances with their property. They are demanding a massive security deposit," my father read aloud, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "Because the new tenant failed the mandatory financial background check, the landlord is legally invoking the emergency protection clause." "How much?" Naomi asked, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "How much do they want?" Richard looked up, his eyes wide and panicked. $200,000, he whispered. "They are demanding a certified cashier's check for exactly $200,000 by Monday morning at 9 o'clock. And if he does not pay it," Naomi pressed, stepping right into my father's personal space. "What happens on Monday morning if your brilliant son does not hand them $200,000 in cash?" My father looked back down at the legal injunction, his hands shaking just as violently as Brandon's had. "If the funds are not fully secured by the deadline, the commercial landlord will instantly change the locks on the facility. They will legally seize every single physical asset inside the building. The delivery trucks, the sorting machines, everything. They will liquidate all of the equipment to cover the remaining balance of the broken lease." Brandon let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sliding slowly down the expensive wallpaper until he was sitting completely defeated on the cold hardwood floor of the grand foyer. The brilliant illusion of his massive corporate empire was now entirely dead. He possessed absolutely no clients. He possessed absolutely no operating cash. And by 9 o'clock on Monday morning, he would not even possess a physical building to walk into. His beautiful pregnant wife had openly promised to divorce him and strip away whatever equity remained in his personal assets. Our arrogant parents had completely drained his finances to line their own pockets. The absolute worst Thanksgiving of his entire life was finally culminating in his total, utter destruction. He simply stared blankly ahead into the void, entirely bankrupt. He simply stared blankly ahead into the void, entirely bankrupt. The silence in the grand foyer was broken only by the sound of Brandon's ragged, shallow breathing. But as the sheer reality of his impending destruction fully settled over him, Something inside his fragile mind finally completely snapped. The arrogant, entitled golden boy who had smirked at me over the Thanksgiving turkey just an hour ago completely vanished. He scrambled up from the hardwood floor, but his legs could not support his weight. Instead, he practically crawled across the expensive rug, closing the distance between us until he was directly at my feet. Brandon threw himself down onto his knees right in front of me. He reached out with his trembling, sweaty hands and grabbed the hem of my silk coat. "Audrey, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. "Please, you have to save me. You have the money. Your new corporation has the millions. You can easily write them a check on Monday morning and make this all go away. Please do not let them take everything." I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled hair, which was now completely ruined and plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. "Let go of my coat, Brandon," I commanded, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. He did not let go. He gripped the expensive fabric tighter, burying his face into his hands as the tears freely flowed. "I will do anything," he begged, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "I will completely step down. I will publicly sign the company back over to you immediately. I will come to your new office and work for absolutely free. I will clean your personal office. I will scrub the warehouse floors on my hands and knees. I will take out the garbage every single night. Just please pay the commercial landlord. I cannot go to federal prison. I cannot lose everything I have." My father took a hesitant step forward, clearly horrified by the absolute pathetic sight of his only son begging like a stray dog. "Get up, Brandon," my father barked, trying to inject some authority back into the room. "Have some dignity. We will call the lawyers and figure this out." Brandon whipped his head around to look at our father, his face red and covered in tears. "There is nothing to figure out," he screamed, his voice echoing violently off the high ceiling. "You gave me a dead company, Richard. You stole my money, and you handed me a literal death sentence. There are no lawyers who can magically fix a massive commercial lease default by Monday morning. Audrey is the only one with the operating capital." He turned back to me, looking up with those desperate, pathetic eyes. "Please, Audrey," he whimpered again. "We are blood. We are family." I took a deliberate step backward, ripping the hem of my coat out of his sweaty grasp. "You stopped being my family the absolute second you tried to steal my life work," I said, looking down at him with pure cold disgust. "You wanted to be the chief executive officer, Brandon. You wanted the power and the prestige. Well, the heavy crown is entirely yours. Enjoy the empty warehouse before they completely lock you out of it." Suddenly, another sound cut through his pathetic sobbing. It was the sharp, heavy sound of expensive metal hitting polished wood. Everyone turned their heads back toward the dining room. Naomi had walked back over to the Thanksgiving table. She was standing perfectly straight, her face an absolute mask of cold, calculating resolve. She had just violently yanked her massive diamond wedding ring off her finger and slammed it directly onto the mahogany table right next to the useless corporate transfer documents. Brandon gasped, scrambling slightly backward on the floor. "Naomi, what are you doing?" He choked out, his eyes wide with fresh terror. Naomi ignored him completely. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times and lifted the device to her ear. We all stood there in absolute silence, listening to the line ring. "Hey, it is me, Naomi," said her voice, totally flat and strictly professional. "I need you to come pick me up at Richard's house right now. No, do not get out of the car when you pull up, just idle in the driveway. I am leaving immediately. Yes, everything is completely ruined. I will explain it all in the car." She ended the call and dropped the phone back into her purse. She zipped it shut with a loud, sharp sound that felt incredibly final. Naomi, Brandon pleaded, holding his hands out toward her. "Please do not walk out on me. Not tonight. We have a baby. We can rebuild this." Naomi looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor of the foyer. Her expression held absolutely zero love and zero pity. "I am not rebuilding a single thing with a fraudulent, entitled coward," she said, her words slicing through the air like a razor blade. I am calling my attorney first thing on Monday morning. I am officially filing for divorce, and I am aggressively pursuing full legal custody of my child. Do not try to call me. Do not try to follow me. You are completely dead to me, Brandon. With her final piece spoken, Naomi turned on her heel and walked purposefully toward the heavy double doors. She simply opened the door, stepped out into the freezing autumn night, and left them all entirely behind to rot in the massive nightmare they had created for themselves. The freezing draft from the open door lingered in the grand foyer for a long moment. Brandon remained completely frozen on his hands and knees, staring blankly at the empty space where his furious wife had just stood. The silence in the house was absolute and suffocating. My mother did not rush forward to comfort her precious golden boy. My father did not offer a booming speech about family resilience. They were entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of their own greed. I walked past my pathetic brother without looking down at him. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as I made my way back into the formal dining room. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The glowing warmth of the antique chandelier now felt harsh and incredibly unforgiving. The expensive Thanksgiving feast was totally ruined. The roasted turkey was cold. The crystal wine glasses were scattered haphazardly. The corporate transfer documents resting on the mahogany table looked like literal garbage. I picked up my heavy leather tote bag from the floor and placed it gently on the edge of the table. I stood perfectly straight, taking a deep breath of the sage-scented air. I casually brushed a stray crumb of bread off the fabric of my designer silk dress. I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness washing over my entire body. The massive, heavy chain of family obligation that had dragged me down for over 3 decades had finally snapped. I was no longer the unloved daughter trying desperately to earn a scrap of validation. I was no longer the invisible workhorse pulling the weight of their massive suburban egos. I reached my hand into the side pocket of my tote bag and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. I unzipped the gold zipper and pulled out a heavy metal fountain pen. The sound of the pen cap clicking off echoed loudly in the quiet room. My father slowly walked back into the dining room, his posture completely slumped. My mother followed right behind him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. They stopped at the edge of the table, watching me with expressions of pure defeat. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice completely hollow. He sounded like a man who had rapidly aged 20 years in a single hour. I did not answer him immediately. I laid the checkbook flat on the polished mahogany wood. I smoothed out the crisp paper of the top check. I pressed the metal tip of the fountain pen against the paper and began to carefully write. I wrote out the current date. I wrote the legal name of my father, Richard, and then I carefully wrote out the exact numerical amount, $50,000. 5 years ago, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the silence, I came to you asking for help. I needed a co-signer for a commercial lease to start my business. You graciously provided your signature to secure a $50,000 loan. You then aggressively used that single signature to legally bind me to your absolute control. You held it over my head at every single family gathering. You used it as justification to constantly claim my hard-earned success as your own personal victory. You used it as the ultimate excuse to steal my company today. I signed my name at the bottom of the check with a sharp, definitive flourish. I capped the fountain pen and slipped it back into my tote bag. I gripped the edge of the check and tore it away from the binding with a loud, satisfying rip. I held the crisp piece of paper in my hand for a brief second. I looked at my father, who was staring at the check with a mixture of confusion and absolute dread. I reached across the table, holding the check directly over the centerpiece of their lavish holiday meal. I opened my fingers and let the paper fall. The check fluttered down through the air and landed directly on top of the cold, ruined Thanksgiving turkey. It sat there, resting against the glazed skin, an absolute symbol of our shattered family dynamic. "There is the initial loan you gave me 5 years ago, Richard," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "That is exactly $50,000 drawn directly from my personal corporate account. It clears every single financial debt I have ever owed you." You can use it to help pay off your son's massive commercial lease default, or you can put it back into your luxury retirement fund. I honestly do not care what you do with it. I zipped my tote bag closed and placed the strap over my shoulder. My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper covering her mouth. I looked at both of them one last time, committing their defeated faces to memory. Paid in full, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. We are entirely done. I turned my back on them without waiting for another response. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a steady rhythmic cadence. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who had just conquered an entire kingdom and was casually strolling out of the burning castle. Behind me, the absolute silence of the dining room finally broke. It shattered like a pane of brittle glass under the sheer weight of my mother's escalating hysteria. Audrey Susan shrieked, her voice vibrating with an ugly, desperate rage. "If you walk out that door, you are completely dead to us. Do you hear me? You are absolutely dead to this family. We will never speak to you again. We will completely erase you from our lives." Her desperate threats echoed off the high ceilings of the grand foyer, but they felt entirely weightless. They were just empty words thrown by a powerless woman who had finally run out of ammunition. I did not slow my pace. I did not turn my head to look back at her. I simply reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled the heavy double doors open and stepped directly over the marble threshold. The contrast between the stifling, toxic atmosphere of that house and the outside world was absolutely staggering. The crisp, cool autumn air hit my face instantly, clearing the lingering scent of roasted turkey and heavy, expensive perfume from my lungs. It was completely dark outside. The suburban street was incredibly quiet. The tall oak trees lining the perfectly manicured lawns rustled gently in the cold November wind. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood on the front porch for a moment, pulling my heavy silk coat tighter around my shoulders. Through the thick glass of the front door, I could hear the muffled sounds of absolute chaos finally erupting inside the house. My father had apparently found his voice again and was loudly shouting at Brandon. Brandon was screaming right back, crying hysterically about the commercial lease default. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her wails piercing through the heavy wooden door. The perfect wealthy family was literally tearing itself apart in the foyer, and I was standing on the outside completely untouchable. I took a deep cleansing breath of the freezing air. The cold felt sharp and pure against my skin. For my entire life, I had been taught to fear this exact moment. I had been conditioned to believe that losing my family would be the ultimate tragedy. But standing there on the porch, listening to them destroy each other, I realized I had not lost anything of actual value. I had only lost a group of incredibly selfish parasites who viewed my existence entirely as a financial utility. I had shed a massive, suffocating skin. I walked slowly down the brick pathway toward the driveway. My luxury sports utility vehicle was parked neatly at the curb, reflecting the warm glow of the streetlights. As I approached my car, I noticed Naomi's vehicle idling a few houses down the street. She was sitting in the passenger seat of her sister's sedan, staring straight ahead. She did not look back at the massive house either. We were both survivors of the exact same shipwreck, swimming away from the sinking vessel in entirely different directions. I unlocked my car and opened the heavy driver's side door. The plush leather interior smelled like expensive clean cedar. It smelled like my own hard work. It smelled like complete, absolute independence. I slid into the driver's seat and pushed the ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life with a low, satisfying rumble. I turned on the heated seats and gripped the smooth leather steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settling deep into my bones. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not take one last lingering glance at the massive brick colonial house that had been my absolute prison for 34 years. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the road ahead of me. The dark suburban streets were completely empty, lit only by the occasional warm glow of a street lamp. Every single mile I drove put more permanent distance between my brilliant future and their miserable, toxic past. I turned the heater up and let out a long, slow exhale. The night was incredibly dark, but for the first time in my entire adult life, I could see my path absolutely clearly. I pressed my foot down firmly onto the gas pedal. I drove into the calm night, leaving the absolute worst Thanksgiving of my life entirely behind me forever. Exactly 1 month has passed since I drove into the calm night, leaving the absolute worst Thanksgiving of my life entirely behind me forever. They say that karma is a slow-moving train, but in my family case, it arrived with the speed and destructive force of a massive freight locomotive. The spectacular collapse of my arrogant brother and my deeply manipulative parents did not just happen over a few years. It happened over a matter of days. On that following Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, the commercial real estate landlord executed the emergency injunction. Brandon, of course, did not have the $200,000 cashier's check. He showed up to the massive logistics facility in his expensive tailored suit, only to find private security guards standing outside the chained gates. They did not let him inside to clean out his desk. They simply handed him a formal notice of asset seizure. The massive fleet of delivery trucks, the automated sorting machines, and the entire physical infrastructure of the limited liability company were immediately liquidated to cover the broken commercial lease. By Wednesday afternoon, EcoShift Logistics, LLC, officially filed for absolute Chapter 7 bankruptcy. But the financial nightmare for Brandon was only just beginning. Naomi was a woman of her absolute word. At 8 o'clock that same Monday morning, she filed an emergency petition for divorce. During the brutal discovery process, her aggressive attorneys entered the bright red folder of corporate credit card receipts into the public court record. The judge was absolutely unimpressed by a man who secretly mortgaged his marital home to buy an empty company while simultaneously buying a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet for a completely different woman. Naomi ruthlessly stripped him of every single remaining asset. She forced the immediate sale of their luxury property and walked away with 100% of the remaining equity. She completely secured full legal custody of her unborn child, leaving Brandon with nothing but supervised visitation rights and a mountain of personal debt. Naomi, meanwhile, just closed a record-breaking commercial real estate deal and bought herself a beautiful new townhouse downtown, entirely erasing his last name from all of her professional branding. My parents desperately tried to protect their golden boy. When the Internal Revenue Service inevitably caught wind of the rapid bankruptcy and the highly questionable corporate expenses, they initiated a massive forensic audit. Richard, arrogant as always, hired the most expensive corporate defense attorneys in the state to fight the federal government and keep his precious son out of a federal penitentiary. But elite legal representation costs an absolute fortune. When the dust finally settled and the massive legal bills came due, Richard and Susan realized they were completely trapped in the financial nightmare they had helped create. To pay off the heavy federal tax penalties and the astronomical lawyer fees, my parents were forced to completely drain their luxury retirement trust fund. But even that massive amount of cash was not enough. 2 weeks ago, the massive brick colonial mansion with the manicured lawn and the high ceilings, the exact same house where they had smugly tried to steal my life work, was quietly put on the real estate market. They had to sell their beautiful, pristine fortress just to keep Brandon from wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. They currently live in a cramped 2-bedroom condominium on the far edge of the city. Richard had to completely resign his prestigious membership at the elite country club. The same wealthy men he used to brag to about his massive business acumen now actively avoid eye contact with him. Susan had to drop out of her exclusive social clubs, entirely humiliated by their spectacular fall from grace. As for the brilliant chief executive officer himself, Brandon finally got to experience the harsh reality of the actual working class. Without my massive corporate umbrella to hide under, and without our parents' deep pockets to constantly bail him out, he had to find a way to pay his court-mandated spousal support. Last Tuesday, I sent one of my junior supply chain managers to a local home improvement store to pick up some basic office supplies. She came back and told me she saw Brandon. He was wearing a bright blue polyester vest with a plastic name tag pinned to his chest, working a minimum wage retail job in the plumbing aisle. The man who confidently told me I was relieved of my duties was now spending his days stocking heavy boxes of PVC pipes for $15 an hour. He has a manager who is 10 years younger than him, barking orders over a cheap walkie-talkie. He spends his long shifts sweeping the cold concrete floors and apologizing to angry customers. While Brandon spends his days apologizing to angry retail customers over discounted plumbing supplies, my own daily reality has moved in an entirely different and brilliant direction. I am currently standing in the center of my brand new corporate headquarters. When I officially dissolved my ties with the toxic family limited liability company, I did not just relocate my massive physical assets. I completely relocated my entire life. I moved EcoShift Global to a sleek, modern high-rise building right in the beating heart of Manhattan. My new corner office is absolutely nothing like the small dark room Naomi so viciously mocked at that disastrous dinner. It features massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the iconic New York City skyline. The afternoon sunlight pours into the massive open-concept workspace, reflecting beautifully off the polished white marble floors and the vibrant green plant installations we brought in to match our eco-friendly corporate branding. It is a brilliant open space designed for genuine growth and collaborative innovation, not for family manipulation and endless petty power struggles. Today is the day before the official Thanksgiving holiday, and the atmosphere in my office is absolutely electric. But we are not working on complex supply chain logistics today. Instead, I am hosting a massive, lavish Friendsgiving celebration for my entire dedicated staff and the true friends who actually supported me. I brought in a premium local catering company to set up a massive, beautiful buffet of roasted turkey garlic mashed potatoes and fresh, seasonal vegetables right in the center of our executive boardroom. The air smells like cinnamon apple cider and genuine, unadulterated happiness. The food is completely different from the dry turkey and tense silence of last year. We have fresh cranberry sauce pumpkin pies and an incredible spread of artisan cheeses. Everyone is encouraged to eat as much as they want and to take plenty of delicious leftovers home to their families. I look around the spacious room and see the smiling faces of the people who actually matter. These are the loyal senior managers, the brilliant tech developers, and the dedicated warehouse supervisors who immediately resigned from the old company the exact second I told them I was leaving. They trusted my leadership so completely that they followed me to the new Delaware Corporation without a single moment of hesitation. They are laughing, sharing funny stories, and raising crystal glasses of champagne. There is no underlying toxic tension. There are no secret malicious agendas. There is absolutely no one sitting at this Thanksgiving table secretly plotting to steal my hard-earned equity. My lead software engineer, a brilliant young woman who helped me code the proprietary routing algorithm, walks over and hands me a fresh glass of sparkling cider. She clinks her glass against mine and offers a warm, genuine smile. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year, Audrey," she says, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. I take a slow sip of the sweet drink and look down at the sleek digital tablet resting on my glass desk. She is absolutely right. We have an incredible amount of things to celebrate. Just this morning, I completely finalized the complex legal paperwork for a massive Series A funding round. A major venture capital firm based out of Silicon Valley had been aggressively tracking my impressive corporate restructuring. They saw exactly how efficiently I pivoted the entire business model and legally retained every single top-tier commercial client. They were so incredibly impressed with my ruthless efficiency and my flawless financial ledgers that they officially valued EcoShift Global at over $50 million. They just wired $15 million of liquid operating capital directly into my corporate accounts to help us aggressively expand our infrastructure into the European market. I am no longer just surviving the daily grind of running a local suburban warehouse. I am actively building a massive international empire completely on my own terms. I do not have a narcissistic father looming over my shoulder, constantly claiming credit for my brilliant negotiations. I do not have a manipulative mother telling me to shrink my ambitions to protect a fragile male ego. I am the sole founder and the undisputed chief executive officer, and absolutely nobody can ever take that away from me again. I walk over to the massive glass window and look down at the busy city streets far below. Millions of people are rushing around, living their own complex lives. A year ago, I was completely suffocating under the heavy, oppressive weight of family expectations. I believed that my own massive success was somehow a terrible burden that I had to constantly apologize for just to keep the peace. But standing here, I am entirely free. I slowly look away from the massive window and turn back to face my amazing team. The beautiful sounds of their laughter and the clinking of their glasses fill the room. This is what a real family looks like. For so long, I was aggressively conditioned to believe that family was strictly defined by biology and shared last names. I was taught that blood was a binding contract that forced you to endlessly tolerate disrespect, manipulation, and outright theft. Society constantly tells us that we must forgive our relatives simply because we share the same genetic makeup. But that is a complete and absolute lie. True family is not an obligation you are born into. It is a conscious choice you make every single day. True family celebrates your massive victories instead of actively trying to diminish them to protect their own fragile insecurities. True family does not view your hard work as a communal bank account to be raided whenever they make a terrible personal decision. Looking back at that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I realized something incredibly profound. When people hear my story, they immediately assume that my greatest revenge was the flawless corporate trap I set. They think the ultimate payoff was watching my brother completely lose his mind over the commercial lease default, or watching my parents aggressively drain their luxury retirement fund to keep him out of federal prison. The financial ruin and the total collapse of their fake suburban empire was definitely a satisfying consequence of their own unbridled greed. But the money was never the actual point. The greatest and most exquisite revenge I ever achieved was the quiet realization that I simply no longer care what any of them think about me. For 34 years, my entire sense of self-worth was entirely tethered to their conditional approval. I built a multi-million-dollar logistics company just hoping my father would finally look at me with genuine pride. I bought expensive gifts and funded luxury vacations, hoping my mother would finally stop comparing me to my utterly useless brother. Their opinions dictated my happiness, and their constant criticism kept me locked in an invisible psychological cage. But the exact second I walked out of their front door and stepped into the freezing autumn air, that heavy chain completely shattered. I do not care if my father thinks I am a ruthless traitor. I do not care if my mother tells her former country club friends that I am a terrible, ungrateful daughter. Their voices no longer play on a continuous loop inside my head. Their judgment holds absolutely zero power over my reality. I evicted them from my mind, and the profound silence they left behind is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced. There is an incredible, liberating power in finally accepting that some people are simply committed to misunderstanding your value. You cannot negotiate with parasites. You cannot reason with emotional leeches who only view you as a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish ambitions. When you finally stop pouring your precious energy into toxic relationships that offer absolutely nothing but continuous pain, you create massive open spaces for genuine growth. You redirect that immense power back into yourself. If you are watching this video right now and you are currently feeling trapped by the heavy, suffocating weight of a toxic family dynamic, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your life to people who actively refuse to respect you. You do not owe your hard-earned success to relatives who only reach out when they need a financial bailout. You are allowed to set ironclad boundaries. You are allowed to pack your bags, walk out the front door, and absolutely never look back. Do not let anyone weaponize your own guilt against you. Cut off the toxic leeches who are draining your potential and use that exact same energy to aggressively build your own magnificent empire. You deserve to sit at a table where your presence is genuinely celebrated, not just financially tolerated. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic family member to finally protect your own peace? How did it completely change the trajectory of your life? I would love to read all about your personal triumphs and your own stories of sweet revenge in the comments section below. If my journey resonated with your own experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories about resilience, boundary setting, and massive personal growth. Share this video with someone who desperately needs the courage to finally choose themselves today. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that the best revenge is always building a wildly successful life, completely without them. The story we just explored reveals a hard and deeply uncomfortable truth about human relationships. We are often taught from a very young age that family loyalty is an absolutely unbreakable contract. Society conditions us to believe that sharing a bloodline means we must endlessly tolerate disrespect, manipulation, and even outright betrayal. But Audrey and her incredible journey completely shatters that dangerous illusion. The most profound lesson hidden within the wreckage of her family Thanksgiving dinner is that true loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own self-worth or completely fund the failures of those who refuse to respect you. For over a decade, Audrey played the role of the reliable, invisible workhorse. She continuously dimmed her own brilliance to protect the fragile ego of her entitled brother and accepted the absolute bare minimum of love from her narcissistic parents. But her ultimate victory was not the brilliant corporate trap she laid, or the massive financial ruin her family brought upon themselves. Her greatest triumph was the quiet, powerful realization that she no longer needed their conditional approval to validate her own existence. Walking away from toxic people, even when they are your own parents or siblings, is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. It takes immense courage to look directly at the people who were supposed to protect you and finally decide to protect yourself instead. When you completely stop pouring your precious energy into a bottomless pit of familial guilt, you finally create the necessary space to build a beautiful life. You make room for a chosen family filled with people who actively celebrate your massive success instead of plotting to steal it. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your own life and bravely cut ties with anyone who drains your peace so you can start building the brilliant future you actually deserve.